In a quiet town where nothing ever seemed out of place, Officer Daniel Harris was used to routine patrols and peaceful streets. But everything changed the morning he found a young girl sitting alone on the sidewalk. Dirty, scared, and silent, her tear-filled eyes held a plea that would send chills through anyone. "Please save me." What began as a simple act of concern quickly unraveled into something far darker than Daniel could have imagined. As he and his partner, Officer Sarah Miller, searched for answers, they discovered a chilling connection to an old mansion on the edge of town, a place surrounded by silence and secrets. With every step deeper into the case, they uncovered truths that no one wanted to face, and they realized they were running out of time to save more than just one child. But this story is not just about darkness. It is about light. It is about kindness found in the most unexpected places, and the small acts of courage that ripple out to change lives forever. At its heart lies Grace, a girl who said so little but changed so much, and a community that learned to come together when it mattered most. What secrets were hidden behind the mansion's gates? What drove this little girl to flee? And what truths would Officer Harris uncover? As the pieces of the puzzle came together, they revealed something that would shake the town to its core and offer a chance at redemption. The crisp morning air carried the soft hum of cars in the distance as Officer Daniel Harris drove slowly down Maple Avenue. It was a quiet neighborhood, one where kids rode their bikes in circles on weekends and dogs barked at passing joggers. Most mornings passed without incident, leaving Daniel with little more to do than return friendly waves from neighbors or keep an eye out for speeding cars. But today was different. As he turned the corner onto Pine Street, something caught his attention, a small figure sitting alone on the sidewalk. Daniel squinted through his windshield. It was a child, a girl, no older than 6 or 7, curled up with her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Daniel's brow furrowed as he parked his patrol car along the curb. Grabbing his hat, he stepped out and adjusted his belt. The leaves crunched under his boots as he walked closer, his footsteps soft but steady. The little girl's head snapped up, her large brown eyes locked onto his, wide and tear-filled, like she had been silently begging for someone to notice her. Daniel crouched a few feet away, careful not to get too close too quickly. He knew children in distress often startled easily. "Hey there," he said gently, keeping his voice low. "Are you okay?" The girl did not answer. Her thin shoulders trembled as she hugged her knees tighter. Her clothes were worn and smudged with dirt. Her sneakers, mismatched and too big, looked like they had been picked out of a box of forgotten items. Daniel's heart ached at the sight. He shifted his posture, resting his arm on one knee. "I am Officer Daniel. I work with the police. You are safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated, her lips quivering. Then, in the faintest voice, she whispered 3 words that sent a chill up Daniel's spine. "Please save me." Daniel froze for a brief moment. The words, so soft and yet so desperate, hit him harder than he expected. He had heard pleas for help many times in his career, but there was something different about this. This was not just fear. This was hopelessness. He swallowed hard and smiled softly. "I am here to help you, I promise, but I need to know more. Can you tell me where your family is? Your mom or dad?" The girl shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Whatever had happened, he knew he could not leave her out here alone. "Okay," he said, rising slowly to his feet. "It is all right. Let us get you somewhere safe. You can ride with me in the patrol car. My partner Sarah will be there too. She is very nice. Does that sound okay?" The girl hesitated, but then gave a small nod. That was enough for Daniel. He reached out a hand to her, but she shrank back. He quickly pulled his hand away, understanding her caution. "No worries. You can walk beside me." Step by step, she followed him to the car. Daniel opened the back door and helped her in as gently as possible, making sure she was comfortable before shutting the door. Then, he radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Officer Harris. I have a young girl, approximately 6 to 7 years old, found alone on Pine Street. No ID, no family nearby. Requesting immediate assistance. Over." The static crackled, followed by a voice confirming his report. Daniel sat in the driver's seat and glanced at the rearview mirror. The girl sat stiffly, her small hands gripping the edge of the seat. Her eyes darted around nervously. "You are doing great, kiddo," Daniel said, trying to keep his tone light. "We will figure this out together, I promise." The police station was bustling with quiet activity when Daniel and the girl walked in. Officer Sarah Miller, Daniel's longtime partner, met them at the door. Sarah was known for her calm demeanor and warm smile, which made her an excellent officer when it came to working with families or children. "Who do we have here?" Sarah asked softly, crouching to the girl's eye level. Daniel answered for her. "Found her on Pine Street, no ID. She said 3 words. Please save me." Sarah's smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "Well, we will take good care of you here. My name is Sarah. Do you like stuffed animals? I think we have a few around here." The girl did not respond, but her gaze softened slightly. Inside the station's quiet lounge, Daniel settled the girl into a chair while Sarah went to grab a blanket and something warm to drink. The girl sat motionless, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Daniel leaned against the doorway, watching her carefully. He could not stop thinking about the words she had whispered to him earlier. "Please save me." What had she been running from? Where were her parents? His thoughts were interrupted when Sarah returned with a steaming cup of cocoa. She placed it gently in front of the girl, then draped a soft blue blanket over her shoulders. "Here you go, sweetie. It is warm just for you," Sarah said, her voice kind and steady. The girl looked at the cocoa but did not move to drink it. Sarah glanced at Daniel, concern flickering across her face. "Any leads yet?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head. "Nothing so far. Dispatch is checking for any missing child reports, but there is nothing in the system yet." Sarah frowned, her gaze returning to the little girl. Someone must be looking for her. Kids do not just appear out of nowhere. "Maybe," Daniel said quietly, though he was not so sure. The girl's dirty clothes, mismatched shoes, and quiet desperation painted a troubling picture. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat at his desk reviewing reports while Sarah took over watching the girl. The station buzzed with quiet conversations as officers came and went, most of them casting curious glances at the small figure bundled in the blanket. An hour later, an elderly woman entered the station. Her silver hair was pinned neatly under a knitted hat, and she clutched a tattered scarf in her hands. She looked around until her gaze landed on the girl sitting in the corner. Her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness," she murmured softly. Daniel noticed her reaction and stood. "Ma'am, do you know her?" The woman nodded slowly, her face full of concern. "I have seen her before. She wanders near the old mansion on the hill. I always thought something was not right, but I did not know how to help." Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah, who had just entered the room. "The mansion?" Sarah asked. "Yes," the woman replied. "It is owned by a man named Charles Evans. He keeps to himself, but I have seen strange things there. Lights at odd hours, people coming and going." The girl. She paused, looking back at the child. "I think she has been there before." The girl shifted in her chair, curling into herself even more. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Something about this story did not sit right with him. "Thank you, ma'am," he said to the woman. "You have been very helpful." The woman smiled faintly, her expression soft. "I just wanted to help, officer. Sometimes we need to look closer at the things others ignore." As evening fell, Daniel sat in the station's break room with a cup of coffee, staring out the window. His mind replayed the events of the day, the girl's plea, the woman's quiet kindness, and the mention of the mansion on the hill. His gut told him this was just the beginning. In the next room, the little girl slept on a cot, wrapped in the blue blanket Sarah had given her. She looked peaceful for the first time all day, though her small face still held faint traces of fear. Daniel sighed, his heart heavy, but determined. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had made her say those 3 words, he would find out, and he would save her. The station grew quiet as night settled in, the faint hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. Officer Daniel Harris sat at his desk, his tired eyes scanning the flickering computer screen. The girl, still unnamed, slept soundly in the lounge under Sarah's watchful eye. Daniel sipped the lukewarm coffee he had forgotten about hours ago. His mind raced with questions he could not answer. The elderly woman's words rang in his head. The mansion on the hill. He knew the place she meant. Everyone in town did. The Evans mansion stood on the edge of the city, surrounded by towering iron gates and sprawling hedges. Its owner, Charles Evans, rarely spoke to anyone. He was a man of wealth and silence, living in a house that was as cold and empty as its reputation. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. If the little girl had been there, why? How did she end up alone on the sidewalk this morning, dirty and desperate? He had seen children in bad situations before, some neglected, others abandoned. But this felt different. This girl had run from something, not just wandered off. Sarah stepped into the room, breaking his thoughts. "She is out like a light," she said softly, crossing her arms. "You would think after everything, she would be too scared to sleep." Daniel nodded. "Kids are tough, tougher than we give them credit for." Sarah pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, her face thoughtful. "Anything come back on missing children?" "Nothing yet." Daniel gestured to the screen. "Dispatch has checked all state and local reports, but there is no match. It is like she just appeared." Sarah sighed. "Someone knows who she is, Daniel. They just have not come forward yet." "That is what worries me," Daniel replied, lowering his voice. "No one looking for a child usually means they do not want her found." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Sarah studied him carefully. "You think there is something to what that woman said about the mansion?" Daniel hesitated. "I do not know. I mean, it is a lead, but I do not have enough to go knocking on Charles Evans' door. The guy could sue us for breathing in his direction without a warrant." Sarah smirked faintly. "True, but that does not mean we stop digging." The woman seemed sincere, and if the girl reacted to the mansion, she trailed off, knowing Daniel had already thought the same thing. He sighed and shut the computer screen. "First thing tomorrow, we start asking questions. I want to know everything about Charles Evans, his house, his routines, and anyone who has been there recently. If he is connected to this, we will find out." Sarah stood and stretched. "Agreed. In the meantime, let me handle the overnight watch. You look like you need sleep." Daniel shook his head. "No, I will stay. I do not want her waking up to an unfamiliar face." Sarah paused, her expression softening. "You have a soft spot for her, don't you?" Daniel looked toward the lounge, where the girl slept on the small cot, her form almost disappearing under the blanket. "I don't know what it is," he admitted. "Maybe it is the way she looked at me, like I was the first person to listen to her." Sarah gave him a knowing smile. "Kids like her can change people, you know, make us see things differently." Daniel did not respond, but her words lingered in his mind long after she left the room. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the station's windows, and Daniel found himself at his desk with fresh coffee and a renewed sense of purpose. The girl, still shy, still silent, sat in the break room with Sarah, slowly nibbling on a granola bar. Daniel watched her through the glass window. She seemed a little less tense than the day before, though she still avoided looking anyone in the eye. Sarah, as always, was patient and kind, speaking to her softly without expecting a response. A sudden knock on the door pulled Daniel's attention. He turned to see the elderly woman, Evelyn Hart, standing in the doorway with a small basket clutched in her hands. "Good morning, officer," she said with a faint smile. "Good morning, ma'am," Daniel replied, standing to greet her. "Please, come in." Evelyn stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if expecting trouble. "I just wanted to check on the little one," she said quietly. "And I brought something for her." She lifted the basket to reveal small, neatly wrapped baked goods. "My late husband and I used to run a bakery. Kids always liked our cinnamon rolls." Daniel smiled faintly, his chest warming at her thoughtfulness. "That is very kind of you." "It is the least I can do," Evelyn replied, her voice soft but steady. "I could not stop thinking about her all night. I do not know what she has been through, but no child should feel so alone." Daniel nodded, his respect for Evelyn growing. "Would you like to sit with her for a bit? She has not spoken much, but I think she likes having people around." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "I would like that." Daniel led her into the break room, where Sarah sat beside the girl. Sarah looked up and smiled warmly at Evelyn. "Hello there," Evelyn said softly, crouching down to the girl's level. "I brought you something." She opened the basket and pulled out a cinnamon roll, its sugary aroma filling the room. "It is sweet and warm, just like you." The girl stared at the treat, her small hands twitching as if unsure whether to take it. Evelyn placed it on the table in front of her, not pushing, not rushing. "It is yours, sweetheart. No one will take it from you." Daniel watched as the girl's eyes flickered with uncertainty. Slowly, she reached for the roll and took a small bite. Sarah leaned over to whisper to Daniel, "That is the first time she has eaten anything willingly since yesterday." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling. Sometimes, it was the smallest acts of kindness that made the biggest difference. As the day went on, Daniel and Sarah worked tirelessly to piece together information about Charles Evans. They found records of his business's real estate holdings, investments, but nothing overtly suspicious. Yet something about him still gnawed at Daniel's instincts. By early afternoon, a call came in from a nearby precinct. A patrol officer reported seeing a young girl near the mansion several times over the past month. He had not thought much of it then, assuming she lived nearby, but now he was not so sure. Daniel hung up the phone, his jaw tightening. It is not just a coincidence. The girl has been near that house before. Sarah grabbed her coat. "So, what do we do?" "We visit Charles Evans," Daniel replied firmly. "We do it by the book, questions only. If we push too hard without evidence, we lose any chance of finding out what is really going on." Sarah nodded, and the two of them headed for the door. As Daniel walked past the break room, he glanced at the girl one last time. She sat beside Evelyn, who was telling her a quiet story while knitting something small and soft. The girl's expression was calm, almost curious. For the first time, her tiny face seemed to hold the faintest hint of hope. Daniel turned away, determination burning in his chest. He would not let her down. The drive to the mansion was quiet, the tension in the car thick. Sarah kept her eyes on the road while Daniel stared out the window, his thoughts a blur. When the tall iron gates of the Evans mansion came into view, Daniel's instincts sharpened. The house loomed in the distance, its dark windows like empty eyes, watching their approach. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah muttered as she parked the car. Daniel did not answer. He was already focused on the man waiting for them at the front steps. Charles Evans stood with his arms crossed, his expression blank but guarded. "Good afternoon, Mr. Evans," Daniel said, stepping out of the car. Charles tilted his head, his gaze sharp. "What brings the police to my door?" Daniel met his eyes evenly. "We just have a few questions." Charles smirked faintly, but there was no humor in it. "Ask away, officer, but I do not have time for games." Daniel's gut tightened. Something about this man was very, very wrong. The Evans mansion loomed large as Officer Daniel Harris and Officer Sarah Miller approached its tall oak doors. Its once grand exterior was showing its age-cracked stone walls, ivy vines creeping over the corners, and a sense of emptiness hanging heavy in the air. The house felt like a secret keeper, each window guarding something it refused to reveal. Charles Evans stood on the top step, his sharp features impassive. His tailored suit and polished shoes contrasted with the decaying house behind him. He gave Daniel and Sarah a look that hovered between amusement and annoyance. "You police certainly are persistent," Charles said, his tone cool and detached. "What can I possibly do for you this time?" Daniel glanced at Sarah, then stepped forward. He kept his voice even. "We're following up on a report about a young girl who's been seen near your property." Charles raised an eyebrow. "A young girl? What would a child be doing here?" "That's what we're trying to find out," Daniel replied, studying the man's face for any crack in his confidence. "Have you noticed anyone unusual around here? Any visitors or children on your property?" Charles's lips curled faintly, like he was holding back a laugh. "No, officer. As you can see, I live alone. I keep to myself." Sarah crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "What about staff? Housekeepers? Gardeners? Anyone who might have seen something?" Charles's expression hardened ever so slightly. "I don't employ anyone regularly. I prefer my privacy." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Everything about the man's demeanor seemed off, too calm, too polished, as if he were playing a part. He decided to press a little further. "We'd like to take a look around, Mr. Evans, just to be sure." Charles straightened, his jaw clenching. "Do you have a warrant?" Daniel didn't flinch. "No, not yet. We're just asking to take a look. It would help clear up any misunderstandings." Charles let out a cold laugh. "I'm afraid misunderstandings are your problem, Officer Harris, not mine. You'll have to do better than vague accusations and wild assumptions." He turned toward the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." As he reached for the handle, a soft noise broke the tense silence. It was almost nothing, a whisper of sound carried on the breeze, but Daniel heard it clearly. It came from somewhere inside the house. It was faint, like the shuffling of small feet. Charles froze, his hand still on the door. He turned his head slightly, his gaze flicking toward Daniel. For the first time, there was something else in his eyes. Was it fear or anger? Sarah noticed too. "Mr. Evans?" she asked, her tone pointed. "Is someone else in the house?" Charles hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking his head. "No, you're imagining things." Daniel's instincts flared. Every part of him wanted to push past Charles and search the house, but without a warrant, his hands were tied. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "We'll be back, Mr. Evans," he said quietly, "and next time, we'll come prepared." Charles opened the door without another word and disappeared inside, the heavy wood slamming shut behind him. As Daniel and Sarah walked back to the patrol car, the weight of the moment hung between them. Sarah broke the silence first. "Did you hear that? Inside the house?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, something or someone was in there." Sarah frowned, glancing back at the mansion. "So, what now? We can't go back without a warrant." "I know," Daniel replied, his jaw tight. "But we're not dropping this. If that girl was in there, we need to find out what's going on." They climbed into the car. Daniel sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as his mind raced. He thought of the little girl back at the station, her fearful eyes, her soft plea for help. She had reacted to the mention of this place. That wasn't a coincidence. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "You think he's hiding something?" "I know he is," Daniel said, his voice low. "But we need more than a hunch to prove it." Sarah nodded. "I'll start digging. Property records, past complaints, anything we can use to build a case. There has to be something on him." "Good," Daniel replied. He glanced back at the mansion one last time, its tall windows staring back at him. "And we'll keep watching. If Charles Evans is up to something, he's bound to slip up. Back at the station, Daniel sat down in front of the girl. She was curled up in the same chair, the blue blanket still draped over her small shoulders. Evelyn Hart sat beside her, knitting quietly, the faint clicks of needles filling the air. The girl looked up as Daniel approached. Her eyes were still wary, but something about her expression softened. "Hey there," Daniel said gently, pulling up a chair to sit across from her. "How are you feeling? Warm enough?" She gave a small nod, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket like a lifeline. Daniel glanced at Evelyn. "Thank you for staying with her." Evelyn smiled faintly. "She doesn't say much, but she's listening. I can tell." Daniel turned his attention back to the girl. "I need to ask you something important," he said softly. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Just nod or shake your head, okay?" The girl stared at him, but did not move. "Do you know the big house on the hill? The one with the gates?" Her eyes widened slightly. She tensed under the blanket, her small fingers curling tighter into the fabric. Daniel's heart sank, but he kept his voice calm. "It's okay. You're safe here. I just need to know, were you there before?" "At the big house?" The girl looked down at her lap. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she gave a small nod. Evelyn stopped knitting, her hands stilling. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Did you run away from there?" This time the nod was quicker. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Are there others there? Other kids like you?" For a moment, the girl did not move. Then, she lifted her gaze to meet his. Her voice so soft it was almost a breath, carried across the room. "Yes," she whispered. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He exchanged a look with Evelyn, whose eyes were wide with shock. "There are others," Evelyn murmured quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew it now, whatever was happening at the Evans mansion. It was bigger than he had thought. He stood, his resolve hardening. "Thank you," he said gently to the girl. "You're very brave. I promise we're going to help you and the others. No one is going to hurt you again." The girl said nothing, but her eyes lingered on him, as if trying to decide whether to trust his words. Daniel turned to Evelyn. "Stay with her, please. I need to start making calls." Evelyn nodded. "Of course, officer." That evening, Daniel and Sarah sat in the break room, the weight of the day pressing on them. Sarah had pulled every record she could find on Charles Evans, but there was nothing solid, no criminal charges, no formal complaints. "It's like he's a ghost," Sarah muttered, flipping through a stack of papers. "How does someone that suspicious stay completely off the radar?" Daniel stared out the window, his jaw set. "Because people like him know how to hide." He turned to Sarah, his voice low and determined. "We have enough to escalate this." The girl confirmed there are others. "I'm calling the judge first thing tomorrow for a warrant." Sarah nodded, matching his resolve. "We'll get those kids out of there, Daniel. Whatever it takes." Daniel glanced at the closed lounge door, where the girl was sleeping again under Evelyn's care. His heart ached at the thought of what she must have seen, what she must have endured. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. They were closer to the truth, closer to helping her and whoever else was trapped in that house. And Daniel would not stop until they were free. The evening air was thick with tension as Officer Daniel Harris sat parked on a shadowy stretch of road near the Evans mansion. The engine of the patrol car hummed faintly, its headlights off. Beside him in the passenger seat, Officer Sarah Miller was scanning the property through a pair of binoculars. The mansion sat silent behind its towering gates, bathed in pale moonlight. Its windows, dark and empty, gave nothing away. Yet both officers knew something was inside. "This place looks like something out of a ghost story," Sarah muttered, lowering the binoculars. "No lights, no movement, just silence." Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the sprawling estate. "It's too quiet. Houses this size don't stay this empty, especially not with someone like Charles Evans living there. Sarah nodded, brushing her hair behind her ear. If he's hiding something or someone, he's careful. He knows how to keep things out of sight. Daniel's jaw clenched. After what the little girl had said earlier, there are others. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Somewhere in that mansion, other children could be waiting, scared and alone. He turned to Sarah. "We're staying out here tonight. If anyone comes or goes, we'll know about it." Sarah looked at him, concern flickering across her face. "You think he'll make a move?" Daniel shrugged, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe, or maybe he's counting on us losing interest. Either way, I'm not leaving until we're sure." The hours passed slowly. The night deepened, the hum of crickets the only sound breaking the silence. Sarah leaned back in her seat, her coat pulled tightly around her as she sipped coffee from a thermos. Daniel sat forward, his eyes sharp as he studied the mansion. Every now and then, a branch rustled in the wind, or a shadow moved across the yard, but nothing more. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Sarah let out a sigh. "You know, you're stubborn even by cop standards," she teased lightly. "Most people would call it a night by now." Daniel didn't smile. "Kids like her don't have the luxury of giving up. The least I can do is keep trying." Sarah's expression softened. She had known Daniel for years, long enough to know what drove him. Daniel didn't talk much about his past, but she knew he had grown up in a tough neighborhood with very little support. His quiet determination to help others came from a place of experience. He understood what it was like to feel small, overlooked, forgotten. "Hey," Sarah said, her tone gentler now. "We'll get them out of there. Whatever Evans is hiding, we'll find it." Daniel glanced at her and nodded. "We have to." Sometime after midnight, Daniel noticed a faint glimmer of light in one of the mansion's second-story windows. It flickered, then disappeared, like someone had turned on a flashlight and quickly shut it off. He sat up straighter. "Did you see that?" Sarah grabbed the binoculars and peered through them. "Where?" "Second floor, far left window." Sarah focused on the spot. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, just as she was about to lower the binoculars, the light appeared again. This time, it moved a narrow beam of light that traced along the edge of the window before vanishing once more. "There's someone up there," Sarah whispered, lowering the binoculars. Daniel's instincts kicked into high gear. "It's not Evans," he said firmly. "He wouldn't use a flashlight in his own house." "Then who?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He was already thinking through their next move. "We can't go in without a warrant," he muttered, frustration in his voice. Sarah shook her head. "No, but we can document this. If there's someone in that house who isn't supposed to be there, we can use this to push for the warrant tomorrow." Daniel nodded, reaching for his phone. He snapped a few photos of the window, though the darkness made it hard to see anything clearly. "It's not perfect, but it's something." They sat in silence for another hour, watching. The light never returned, but Daniel couldn't shake the image from his mind. Someone was inside that house, and whoever it was, they wanted to stay hidden. By the time dawn began to break over the horizon, Daniel and Sarah were both exhausted. The first light of day revealed the mansion in stark detail, its chipped paint, sagging shutters, and crumbling stone walls standing as proof of its long neglect. "Hard to believe a guy like Evans lives here," Sarah muttered, rubbing her tired eyes. Daniel sighed. "People like him hide behind appearances. He wants the world to think he's untouchable." Sarah glanced at the mansion one last time before starting the car. "Well, untouchable or not, we're coming back with that warrant." Daniel leaned his head back against the seat, his mind already racing ahead to the day's tasks. He knew getting the warrant wouldn't be easy. He needed solid evidence to justify it, and so far all they had were suspicions and shadows. But he couldn't let this go. He thought of the little girl back at the station, her quiet voice and frightened eyes, Grace, as Sarah had begun calling her. The name seemed to fit her, somehow fragile but full of potential. And if Grace had escaped that house, others might still be trapped there. That thought was enough to fuel Daniel through his exhaustion. When they arrived back at the station, the place was already stirring with the start of a new day. Daniel's first stop was the lounge, where Evelyn Hart sat quietly beside Grace. Evelyn had fallen asleep in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap, but Grace was wide awake. She looked up as Daniel entered, her small face calm but watchful. Daniel offered her a faint smile as he crouched beside her. "Good morning," he said softly. "Did you sleep okay?" Grace didn't answer, but she held his gaze for a moment before nodding slightly. Daniel noticed something on the table beside her, one of the cinnamon rolls Evelyn had brought yesterday, torn into small, careful pieces. Grace had eaten most of it, leaving only crumbs behind. It was a small thing, but it gave Daniel hope. "You're doing great, kiddo," he said quietly. "We're going to fix this, I promise." Evelyn stirred at the sound of his voice, blinking awake. "Officer Harris?" she murmured, sitting up straighter. "Any news?" Daniel nodded. "We're getting close. Thank you for staying with her, Evelyn. I don't know what we'd do without you." Evelyn smiled faintly, brushing her hands over her lap. "Kindness does not take much effort, officer. She needed someone here, so I stayed." Daniel's throat tightened at her words. Kindness so simple, yet so powerful. Evelyn's quiet support was helping Grace in ways he couldn't fully see. "We'll get to the bottom of this today," Daniel said, standing. "If we play this right, we'll have the warrant before nightfall." Evelyn nodded. "Be careful, officer. That house." She paused, her face clouding over. "That house holds secrets." Daniel turned to Grace one last time. Her wide eyes followed him as he stepped toward the door. "We'll be back soon," he promised. As he walked away, Daniel couldn't help but feel the weight of those words. The girl had trusted him, even if only a little. He couldn't let her down. He would get the warrant. He would search that house, and whatever secrets the Evans mansion was hiding, he would uncover them, no matter what it took. The early morning sun crept over the rooftops as Officer Daniel Harris and Officer Sarah Miller pulled into the precinct parking lot. The exhaustion from the previous night sat heavy on their shoulders, but neither spoke of it. They had work to do. Inside, the station was already alive with activity phones ringing, officers checking reports, and dispatchers calling out updates. Daniel moved with purpose, his steps quick and determined as he headed straight for Captain Warren's office. Sarah followed close behind. "Are you sure he'll approve the warrant?" she asked, lowering her voice as they reached the captain's door. "He has to," Daniel replied, his voice firm but quiet. "We have enough to make the case now. Grace's statement, the flashlight in the mansion, and the girl's connection to that house." Sarah nodded, but doubt flickered in her expression. "I hope it's enough for the judge." Inside the office, Captain Warren listened as Daniel laid out everything they had so far. The older man sat back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him as he considered their request. His face, weathered by years on the force, gave away little of what he was thinking. "So, let me get this straight," Captain Warren said, his deep voice calm but pointed. "You're asking for a search warrant based on a flashlight in a window and the word of a scared 6-year-old? Daniel stood his ground. "It's more than that, sir. We have a credible witness who's seen the girl near that property before. She reacted to the mansion in a way that tells me she's been there, and not by choice." Captain Warren raised an eyebrow. "You're operating on instincts here, Harris." Daniel met his gaze evenly. "Yes, sir, and my instincts tell me there are children in that house who need help." Grace confirmed it. "If we wait too long, we might lose our chance." The captain stared at him for a long moment, the room heavy with silence. Finally, he let out a sigh. "I'll call the judge," he said, grabbing the phone. "But this better turn up something. If you're wrong, Evans will bury us in lawsuits." Daniel felt the tight knot in his chest ease, but only slightly. "Thank you, sir." An hour later, Daniel and Sarah stood outside the precinct, a signed warrant in Daniel's hands. The thick paper felt heavier than it should, carrying the weight of what they were about to do. Sarah glanced at him as they walked to the patrol car. "We're doing the right thing, you know." "I know," Daniel replied, sliding into the driver's seat. "I just wish we didn't have to wait so long to prove it." They drove in silence toward the Evans mansion, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Daniel's mind replayed Grace's soft voice from the day before. "There are others." Those 3 words had stayed with him, driving him forward even when the answers felt out of reach. This was their chance to make it right. The sun hung low in the sky by the time they reached the mansion. 2 squad cars followed closely behind them, their lights off, their engines idling softly. Daniel parked the car just outside the wrought iron gates and stepped out, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around him. The mansion looked as imposing as ever, its dark windows glaring down at them. Daniel squared his shoulders as he approached the front steps, Sarah walking beside him. The other officers followed, ready to assist if needed. Charles Evans was waiting for them at the door. His suit was crisp, his expression calm, but there was something different about him this time. His eyes, sharp and calculating, held a flicker of unease. "Back again so soon, Officer Harris?" Charles asked, his voice smooth but edged with tension. Daniel held up the warrant. "We have a search warrant, Mr. Evans." "Step aside." Charles's smile faltered. "This is absurd. You have no right to." "The warrant says we do," Sarah cut in, her voice firm. "Now move, or we'll move you." For a moment, Charles looked like he might argue, but then he stepped back with a theatrical sigh, his hands raised in mock surrender. "By all means, officer, waste your time." Daniel didn't wait for another word. He motioned for the other officers to follow as they entered the house. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet. Dust clung to the ornate furniture and heavy drapes, and the air carried the faint scent of age and neglect. Daniel's boots echoed on the polished floors as he moved through the rooms, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. "Search everything," he instructed the team. "Basement, attic, closets, anywhere someone could hide." Sarah stayed close as they moved deeper into the house. "You notice how empty it feels in here?" she asked quietly. "No photos, no decorations. It's like no one really lives here." Daniel nodded, his flashlight sweeping across a bare hallway. "Because it's not a home. It's a front for something else." The search started slow, with room after room turning up nothing. The mansion was large, its winding halls and heavy doors giving the team plenty of ground to cover. Daniel's focus sharpened as they reached the far end of the house, where an old wooden door sat slightly ajar. He pushed it open, revealing a staircase that led down into darkness. "Basement," Daniel said, his voice low. He glanced at Sarah. "Ready?" She nodded, her hand resting on the grip of her flashlight. "Let's go." They descended the stairs carefully, the old wood creaking under their weight. The air grew colder as they reached the bottom, the faint smell of damp earth hanging heavy. Daniel's flashlight swept across the basement walls, revealing old stone and rusted shelves. At first glance, the room seemed empty, but as Daniel moved closer to the far wall, he noticed something strange, a faint seam in the stone, as if a doorway had been hidden there. "Sarah," he called softly, pointing to the wall. "Look at this." Sarah moved beside him, her flashlight tracing the seam. "A hidden door?" Daniel ran his hand along the edge until he found it a small latch concealed in the shadows. He hesitated for only a moment before pulling it. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Let's go." The passageway led to a second, smaller basement room. It was cold and dark, the air thick with silence. But Daniel's flashlight revealed the truth almost immediately. In the corner of the room, huddled under a thin blanket, was a small figure. A child. Daniel's chest tightened. He stepped forward slowly, crouching down so as not to startle them. "Hey there," he said softly. "You're safe now. We're here to help." The child, a boy, no older than 8, looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. He was thin and pale, his face streaked with dirt. Sarah knelt beside Daniel, her voice calm and steady. "It's okay. You don't have to be afraid. We're police officers. We're here to take you somewhere safe." The boy blinked at them, his small body trembling. Finally, he whispered, "There are more." Daniel's heart dropped. "Where?" The boy pointed toward the far wall, where another door, smaller and rusted, stood half-hidden behind a pile of crates. "Call for backup," Daniel told Sarah urgently. "We're going to need help." Sarah nodded and stepped away to radio the team as Daniel moved toward the second door. His hands shook as he reached for the handle, his flashlight bouncing off the rusted metal. When he pushed it open, his breath caught in his throat. The room beyond was larger, and inside, several small cots were lined against the walls. On each cot sat a child, thin, silent, and scared. Their eyes turned toward him as the light fell on them, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. Daniel's voice was thick as he spoke. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now. We're getting you out of here." Behind him, Sarah's footsteps echoed as she returned, her voice urgent on the radio. "We found them," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. "We found the others." The room was deathly quiet, except for the faint hum of Officer Daniel Harris's flashlight and the distant crackle of Sarah Miller's radio call. The beam of Daniel's light swept over the cots lined against the cold stone walls. Each held a child, their eyes wide and wary, staring silently at the 2 officers who had broken into their hidden world. Daniel's heart pounded as he took in the scene. There were 6 children in total, frail, shivering, and impossibly small. They looked like ghosts of themselves, dirt smudging their faces and their clothes hanging loose on thin frames. Their silence felt heavier than any sound could have been. Daniel knelt slowly in the doorway, trying to make himself as unthreatening as possible. "Hey there," he said gently, his voice a low murmur. "It's okay. You're safe now. My name is Daniel, and this is Sarah. We're here to help." The children didn't move. Most of them sat frozen on their cots, their hollow eyes flickering between Daniel and Sarah. Behind him, Sarah's voice came through, steady but urgent. "Backup is on the way. Ambulances too." Daniel nodded without turning, keeping his attention on the children. His chest felt tight as he looked at them, each of their small, fragile forms, a testament to what they had been through. He forced his voice to stay calm. "You don't have to stay here anymore. We're going to take you somewhere safe, somewhere warm." In the corner, a boy, the same one they had found in the first room, stepped hesitantly toward Daniel. His face was pale, but there was something in his eyes, a spark of trust. "Are you really going to help us?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Daniel's throat tightened. "I promise. No one is going to hurt you anymore." The boy looked over his shoulder at the others, as if seeking their permission to believe Daniel's words. Slowly, one of the younger girls on a cot began to shift. She looked no older than 5, her tangled hair falling into her face as she clutched a small, tattered blanket to her chest. "Is it safe?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah stepped forward, crouching beside Daniel. "It's safe," she said softly, her warm smile breaking through the tension. "We're going to take care of you. You don't have to be afraid anymore." The girl stared at her for a long moment before nodding weakly. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the basement as additional officers and medics arrived. The once quiet space filled with quiet urgency as the team began their work. Paramedics moved carefully between the cots, checking each child for injuries, wrapping them in blankets, and offering soft words of comfort. Daniel stood back, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Relief began to seep into his chest, though it was mixed with a simmering anger. How could something like this happen? How could no one have noticed what Charles Evans was hiding right under their noses? Sarah appeared beside him, her expression tense but hopeful. "They're okay, Daniel," she said softly. "Malnourished and scared, but they're going to be okay." Daniel exhaled a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Good," he muttered. "That's what matters." Sarah nodded, but studied him for a moment. "What about Grace?" she asked carefully. Daniel's gaze shifted to the far wall, his thoughts pulling back to the small girl sleeping at the station under Evelyn Hart's watchful eye. "She led us here," he said quietly. "She saved them." Upstairs, the team continued their sweep of the mansion. Officers opened doors, pulled back heavy curtains, and checked every corner. Daniel followed them, his flashlight sweeping through each room, searching for anything else Evans might have hidden. The house felt empty now, like the secrets it had been holding for so long had finally escaped. Daniel paused in what appeared to be Charles Evans's study. The room was pristine, lined with bookshelves, a grand mahogany desk at its center. On the desk sat a silver-framed photo of Evans in his younger years, standing in front of the mansion with an expression of cold pride. Daniel's lip curled in disgust. The man had turned his wealth and power into a shield, hiding something monstrous in the basement of his home. "Daniel." Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, drawing his attention to the doorway. She held up a small notebook, its edges worn. "We found this in a locked drawer in the kitchen. It's got names, dates. We think it's a log of the kids who've been here." Daniel's stomach turned as he took the notebook from her, flipping it open. The handwriting was precise, neat, almost clinical. Each page listed a date, a name, and what looked like coded notes beside it. "Proof," Daniel said, his voice low and grim. "This will help build the case." Sarah nodded. "We need to make sure he never gets away with this." Daniel closed the notebook, his jaw tight. He won't. By the time the search was complete, the mansion had been turned upside down. Officers led the children out carefully, one by one, carrying the youngest in their arms. The sunlight outside seemed almost jarring after the darkness of the basement, but it felt like a small victory. Daniel stood near the patrol cars, watching as medics helped the children into waiting ambulances. The boy who had spoken to him earlier turned to look at Daniel as he climbed into the back of the vehicle. "Thank you," the boy said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the noise. Daniel offered him a small nod, his throat too tight to respond. Sarah stepped beside him, her voice soft. "You okay?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He watched as the last of the children were loaded into the ambulances, the doors shutting with quiet finality. Finally, he let out a long breath. "I will be," he said. Back at the station, the atmosphere had shifted. Word of the discovery had spread quickly, and the other officers moved with a quiet sense of purpose. This was the kind of case that stuck with you, a reminder of the darkness people was capable of, but also of the good that came from refusing to look away. Evelyn Hart was still sitting in the lounge when Daniel returned. She was knitting again, her hands moving steadily, but she looked up as he entered. "You found them, didn't you?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded, lowering himself into the chair beside her. "Yeah, we did." Evelyn smiled faintly, her expression both relieved and sad. "Good. Those children, they deserved better." Daniel's gaze shifted to the couch, where Grace was still sleeping peacefully under her blanket. The faint rise and fall of her small chest were a quiet comfort. "She's stronger than she knows," Evelyn murmured, following his gaze. Daniel nodded, his voice low. "Yeah, she is." For a moment the room was silent, the weight of everything settling in. Finally, Evelyn set down her knitting and looked at him. Kindness brought her here, she said softly. It brought all of us here, in its own way. Never forget that. Daniel let her words sink in, the truth of them settling in his heart. This entire case, this moment, had been built on small acts of care. Evelyn noticing the girl wandering near the mansion, Grace trusting him enough to speak, Sarah's steady support. Each piece had led them here, to this point, where they could finally offer the children the safety they deserved. He looked back at Grace, his chest swelling with quiet determination. There was still work to do. Charles Evans had been arrested, but the investigation would take time. But for now, the children were safe. And sometimes that was enough. The station was quieter than usual that evening. After the children were found and Charles Evans had been taken into custody, the weight of the day lingered like a fog in every room. Officers moved quietly, their faces serious, their conversations hushed. A case like this was rare, a dark secret hiding in plain sight, and it was hard not to feel its echo. Officer Daniel Harris sat at his desk, staring at the open case file in front of him. His hands were still smudged with dirt from earlier, evidence of hours spent in the Evans mansion's basement. Across the pages of the file were photos of the children, blankets wrapped around their thin shoulders, their eyes wide and cautious as paramedics checked them over. The image of Grace came back to him again, her small, fragile form sleeping on the couch in the station's lounge, Evelyn Hart beside her like a quiet guardian. Grace had been the key to all of this, her bravery leading them to those children, but Daniel knew her journey was far from over. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the doorframe. Sarah Miller stepped into the room, a to-go cup of coffee in her hand. She offered it to him with a faint smile. "Here," she said. "You look like you need it." Daniel accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Thanks." Sarah dropped into the chair across from him, her eyes scanning the open file. "Long day," she murmured. "Yeah," Daniel replied, his voice low. "Feels like it's only halfway done." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "What's on your mind?" Daniel ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, letting out a sigh. "The kids are safe now, but what comes next? The system is complicated. And Grace, she's been through so much already. What if she doesn't land in a place that can really help her?" Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "You're thinking too far ahead, Daniel. We did our job today. We got them out. That's what matters right now." Daniel nodded, but the worry in his chest didn't fully fade. "I know. I don't want her to end up forgotten. She trusted us to help her." Sarah softened. "And we will. We're not walking away from this." The next morning, Daniel found himself back in the lounge, a coffee cup in one hand, as he quietly watched Grace. She sat cross-legged on the couch, her small hands gripping a stuffed rabbit someone from Child Services had brought. Her hair was cleaner today, brushed into soft waves that framed her face, but her eyes still held that guarded look. Beside her, Evelyn Hart was knitting again, the steady click of needles filling the silence. She glanced up when Daniel entered, her warm eyes soft with understanding. "She's a quiet one," Evelyn murmured, nodding toward Grace. "But I can see her opening up bit by bit. She just needs time." Daniel crouched beside the couch, resting his forearms on his knees. "Hey, Grace," he said gently. "How are you feeling today?" Grace looked at him but said nothing, her fingers still clutching the rabbit tightly. Daniel smiled softly. "I want you to know something, okay? You're really brave. Because of you, we found those kids. You helped save them." She blinked, her expression shifting, something unreadable passing through her eyes. Slowly, she looked down at the stuffed rabbit and whispered, "Are they safe?" Daniel's chest tightened at the sound of her voice, so small but so heavy with worry. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "They're safe, just like you are." Evelyn paused in her knitting, her face softening as she watched the exchange. Grace's fingers loosened slightly around the rabbit, as though Daniel's words had lifted some invisible weight from her shoulders. "Where will they go?" Grace asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "People are going to take care of them. Good people, who will make sure they're safe and happy." Grace looked up at him again, her expression unsure. "Like her?" She tilted her head toward Evelyn, who smiled faintly. "Yes," Daniel said with a small nod, "like her." Evelyn's eyes glistened slightly, though she said nothing. She simply reached out and rested a gentle hand on Grace's knee, her quiet presence speaking louder than words ever could. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Sarah met with the caseworker from Child Protective Services, a woman named Margaret Bell. Margaret was soft-spoken but efficient, her calm demeanor giving Daniel a small measure of reassurance as she outlined the steps moving forward for Grace and the other children. "She's going to need time," Margaret said, tucking a strand of gray hair behind her ear as she flipped through her notes. "Cases like this don't resolve overnight. We'll find her a foster family somewhere stable where she can begin to heal." Daniel's brow furrowed. "And what happens if no one steps up?" Margaret gave him a patient look. "Someone always steps up, Officer Harris. There's better in this world than we give it credit for." Her words reminded Daniel of Evelyn, how the elderly woman had shown up at the station with nothing but kindness and cinnamon rolls. She hadn't been asked to help, but she had anyway. Sometimes the smallest acts made the biggest difference. As evening fell, Daniel found himself back in the lounge one last time. Grace sat at the small table where Evelyn had laid out a puzzle, her small hands carefully fitting pieces together. It was the most relaxed he had seen her since that first morning. Evelyn looked up as Daniel approached, her expression warm. "She's doing better today," she said softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "Thanks to you." Evelyn shook her head, her knitting needles stilling in her lap. "No, thanks to you. You gave her a chance when no one else saw her." Daniel looked at Grace, his chest tightening with a quiet mix of pride and sorrow. She had been through so much, yet here she was still fighting, still trying to piece herself back together like the puzzle in front of her. He crouched beside her again, his voice soft. "Hey, Grace. Tomorrow, Miss Margaret is going to help you find a new place to stay. Somewhere nice, with people who will take care of you." Grace looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Will you come back?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice firm. "I'll check on you. I promise." Grace nodded slowly, as though deciding she could believe him. Then, to his surprise, she reached out and handed him one of the puzzle pieces. "Here," she said softly. "You can help me." Daniel took the small piece, his throat tightening. He glanced at Evelyn, who smiled knowingly, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap. As he placed the piece into the puzzle, something in Daniel shifted. Grace was still broken in places, but she wasn't alone, not anymore. That night, as Daniel sat alone in his patrol car outside the station, he thought of everything that had led them here. Grace's whispered words, "Please save me." The flashlight in the Evans mansion, the hidden room filled with scared children. There had been darkness, yes, but there had also been light. Evelyn's kindness, Sarah's steady support, Grace's quiet courage. Margaret had been right. There was better in the world than they often saw. Sometimes you just had to look a little closer. As Daniel stared out at the quiet streets, he made himself a silent promise. He wouldn't stop fighting for kids like Grace. Because sometimes, saving one person could change everything. The sun hung low in the sky as Officer Daniel Harris parked his patrol car in front of the local community center. The building, with its faded brick walls and weathered wooden doors, stood as a gathering place for a town still coming to grips with the events of the past few days. Word about the children had spread. leaving the community shocked and angry, but also determined to do something. Daniel stepped out of the car, tugging at the collar of his uniform. He was tired. Days without proper rest had worn him thin, but there was still more to do. The town's mayor had asked the police department to join a meeting with volunteers, social workers, and local families. Inside the center, the hum of voices echoed through the large main hall. Folding chairs had been set up in rows, with tables covered in flyers and boxes of donated supplies lining the walls. Daniel scanned the room, his gaze falling on familiar faces: neighbors, teachers, business owners. They looked up when he entered, conversations pausing momentarily. Sarah Miller appeared beside him, holding a clipboard and offering a faint smile. "I've never seen this place so full," she said softly. Daniel nodded, his eyes moving across the room. "People want to help. After what happened, I think they feel like they need to." The door opened again, and Daniel turned to see Evelyn Hart walking in with her usual calm grace. She carried a small basket of baked goods and a worn leather bag slung over her arm. Evelyn caught his eye and smiled, making her way over. "Good evening, Officer Harris," she said warmly. "Busy night, I see." Daniel offered a tired but genuine smile. "Good to see you, Evelyn. I didn't expect you to be here." Evelyn placed the basket on a nearby table and waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for anything. When a community comes together like this, it's a chance to do something real." Daniel's chest tightened with quiet gratitude. In the past few days, Evelyn had become a constant presence, showing up when others didn't know how, offering small acts of care that made all the difference. The meeting began shortly after. The mayor, a tall man in his early 50s with a steady voice, stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd. "What happened in our town shocked us all," he began, his tone firm but kind. "These children, hidden away and forgotten, were let down in ways we can't fully understand. But now, we have a choice to look away or to stand together and help them heal." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded solemnly, their faces lined with concern. The mayor gestured to the tables of donations. "Foster families have come forward, but these kids will need more than a roof over their heads. They need care, understanding, and support. That's where we all come in." Daniel watched as people began to organize, signing up to volunteer, donating clothes and supplies, and offering services. A local teacher promised tutoring sessions, while a retired nurse volunteered to help with medical care. Small businesses pledged food, toys, and funds. It was a quiet hum of hope, born out of the community's collective guilt and desire to make things right. As the meeting continued, Daniel and Sarah made their way around the room, answering questions and offering reassurance. They knew the investigation wasn't over. Charles Evans's case would take time, and there was still much to uncover, but for now, the focus was on the children. At one of the tables, Evelyn was helping sort donated clothing when Daniel approached. She glanced up at him, her eyes soft but thoughtful. "Seeing this gives me hope," she said, folding a small sweater, "for those children and for this town." Daniel nodded, leaning against the table. "It's good to see people stepping up. They'll need it." Evelyn paused, her hands stilling. "And what about you, officer? Have you given yourself a moment to rest?" Daniel looked at her, surprised by the question. "I'm fine. There's still work to do." Evelyn gave him a knowing look. "I know that look, young man. I saw it on my husband's face for years when he worked as a firefighter. You're carrying this on your shoulders, and it's heavy." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about me. It's about them." Evelyn smiled faintly, her voice soft. "You're right. But don't forget that you're part of this too. Grace trusted you, and that means something. You've given her a reason to believe people can be good." Daniel glanced down at the sweater Evelyn had folded, her words sinking in. He had spent so much time focused on finding answers and protecting Grace that he hadn't stopped to think about the impact she had on him. "You've done good, Officer Harris," Evelyn said, patting his arm gently. "Don't forget that." The crowd had thinned by the time Daniel and Sarah finally left the community center. The air outside was cool, the stars just beginning to dot the sky. As they walked toward the patrol car, Sarah looked at Daniel thoughtfully. "You know, this kind of thing doesn't happen everywhere." Daniel glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "People," Sarah said, gesturing toward the building behind them. "Coming together like that? It's not always a given. But here, they want to help. It says something about this town." Daniel nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Yeah, it does." Sarah paused beside the car, studying him carefully. "You're still thinking about Grace, aren't you?" Daniel didn't deny it. "She's tough, Sarah, smarter than most adults I know, but she's been through things no kid should ever face." Sarah leaned against the car door. "She's got you looking out for her. That's more than a lot of kids get." Daniel looked at her, his voice quiet. "I don't know if that's enough." Sarah smiled faintly. "You'll figure it out. You always do." When Daniel returned to the station later that night, the building was quieter than it had been in days. He made his way to the lounge, where Grace was curled up on the couch again, fast asleep. Evelyn had left earlier, but a small, hand-knitted scarf lay folded beside Grace, a gift, no doubt, left behind, with care. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching Grace's steady breathing. She looked smaller than ever under the soft light of the lamp, but there was something peaceful about her now, something that hadn't been there before. He stepped closer, pulling the blanket up to her chin so she wouldn't get cold. As he turned to leave, her quiet voice stopped him. "Officer?" Daniel turned back, his voice soft. "Hey, I thought you were sleeping." Grace shifted slightly, her eyes opening just enough to look at him. "The kids, are they okay now?" Daniel crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. "Yeah, they're okay. They're safe." Grace blinked sleepily, as if she were processing his words. "Good," she whispered. After a pause, she added, "Are you okay?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. Finally, he smiled faintly. "Yeah, kiddo, I'm okay." Grace seemed satisfied with that. Her eyes fluttered closed again, and she settled back into the couch, her breathing slowing as she drifted off to sleep. Daniel stayed there for a moment, the room quiet around him. He thought of the community center, of the people who had shown up, of Evelyn's steady kindness, and of Grace's small voice asking if he was okay. Sometimes, he realized, healing wasn't about grand gestures. It was about small moments, the kind that added up until they became something bigger. Grace had saved those children with her courage, and now she was teaching him something too, that even in the darkest places, light could break through. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the small office at the precinct, casting warm patterns across the desk where Officer Daniel Harris sat. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched by his elbow as he flipped through the paperwork laid out in front of him, documents detailing the arrangements being made for Grace and the other rescued children. For the first time in days, the station felt calm. The chaos of the investigation had finally subsided, replaced by a quiet determination to ensure that what had happened would never happen again. The case against Charles Evans was strong. Daniel and Sarah's search of the mansion had turned up overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He would be spending the rest of his life behind bars, but for Daniel, it was not enough to simply put the man away. His mind remained on Grace. Her small voice, her cautious trust, and the way she had quietly changed everything. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts, and Daniel looked up as Sarah Miller entered the office. She carried a manila folder under one arm and a cup of coffee in the other. "Good news," she said, setting the folder on his desk and pulling up a chair. "Margaret from Child Protective Services called. She found a placement for Grace." Daniel straightened in his seat. "Where?" "A foster family out in Ashton Grove," Sarah replied. A couple named Robert and Lisa Monroe. They've been fostering kids for years. Margaret says they're good people, stable, kind, and patient. Exactly what Grace needs. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That's a relief. Sarah studied him carefully. You can go with her, you know. Margaret's taking her out there this afternoon. I think Grace would like that. Daniel hesitated, his thoughts tangling together. Part of him wanted to go, to make sure Grace felt safe and supported as she started this new chapter. But another part of him wondered if it would be better for her to move on without him a clean break. She's tough, Sarah, he said finally. She'll be okay. Sarah gave him a knowing look. Yeah, she's tough, but that doesn't mean she doesn't need people who care about her. Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. You think I should go? Sarah smiled faintly. I think you already know the answer to that. Later that afternoon, Daniel stood just outside the station's lounge, watching through the glass window as Margaret knelt beside Grace, explaining what was about to happen. Grace sat on the couch, her small hands folded in her lap, her wide eyes locked on Margaret's face. The worn knitted scarf that Evelyn had left for her was draped loosely around her neck, the soft blue fabric contrasting with her dark hair. When Margaret finished, Grace looked down at the stuffed rabbit she still carried, her fingers brushing over its worn ears. Daniel took a steadying breath before stepping into the room. Margaret looked up at him and smiled warmly. Officer Harris, she said softly. I told Grace you might be coming with us. Grace looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Daniel crouched down so he was at her eye level. Hey, kiddo, he said gently. How are you holding up? Grace shrugged, her eyes flicking to the floor. Okay, I guess. Daniel smiled faintly, though his chest ached at her small voice. Margaret says the family you're going to is really nice. They've got a big house, lots of books, and a dog named Scout. You like dogs? Grace's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. I guess so. Daniel hesitated before continuing. You're going to be safe there, Grace. I know it's scary starting over, but this family, they're good people. You'll have your own room and a warm bed. And? He paused, choosing his words carefully. You'll have people who care about you. Grace looked at him, her brown eyes searching his face. Will you still come back? She whispered. Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't want to make promises he couldn't keep, but he couldn't let her think he was walking away. Yeah, he said softly. I'll check in. I'll make sure you're okay. You're not alone in this, Grace. She stared at him for a moment longer before nodding slowly. Okay. Margaret stood and smiled down at Grace. Are you ready to go? Grace glanced at Daniel once more, then clutched the stuffed rabbit tightly, and stood. She let Margaret take her hand, though her grip on the rabbit never loosened. Daniel followed them outside, where Margaret's car sat parked at the curb. He opened the back door for Grace, who climbed in quietly, her small figure almost disappearing under the oversized scarf. As Margaret buckled her in, Daniel crouched beside the door, resting his arms on the frame. You're going to be okay, Grace, he said gently. This is a new start for you, a good one. Grace looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. You promise? Daniel smiled, though his voice was thick when he answered, I promise. She nodded once, her grip tightening on the rabbit. Margaret climbed into the driver's seat, starting the car as Daniel stepped back. He watched as they pulled away, Grace's small face visible through the window as she looked back at him. He raised a hand in a wave, and after a moment, she lifted her hand in return. As the car disappeared around the corner, Daniel let out a slow breath. He knew Grace's journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, nights filled with nightmares, and days when trust felt impossible. But she was strong. He could see it in the way she carried herself, even now. And for the first time, he believed she was going to be okay. That evening, Daniel found himself standing on the front steps of Evelyn Hart's small home. The old woman greeted him with a smile, her knitting needles resting on the arm of her chair as she invited him inside. "Good to see you, officer," she said as he stepped into the cozy living room. "How's our girl?" Daniel smiled faintly. "She's on her way to a new home, a good one." Evelyn nodded, her expression soft. "That's all we can hope for, isn't it? A safe place and good people." Daniel sat down in the chair across from her, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You were right, you know," he said quietly. "Kindness brought us here. It's what saved her." Evelyn's eyes twinkled as she picked up her knitting again. "Kindness and a little courage, officer. From all of us, you did more than you think." Daniel looked out the window, his thoughts drifting to Grace. He imagined her settling into her new room, her small hands still holding that stuffed rabbit as she stared out at her new world. It wouldn't be easy, but she had people now. She wasn't alone. Evelyn's voice broke through his thoughts. "What will you do now?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Keep doing what I've always done. Show up. Help where I can. One kid at a time, if that's what it takes." Evelyn nodded approvingly. "That's a good answer, officer." Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling a small weight lift from his chest. Grace's story wasn't over, but a new chapter had begun for her, and for him, that was enough. That night, as Daniel drove back to his apartment, the streets of the town felt quieter, calmer. He rolled down the window, letting the cool air fill the car, and thought about Grace, her quiet strength, her whispered plea for help, and the way she had begun to smile, just a little, when she realized she was safe. In the end, it wasn't grand gestures or perfect endings that made a difference. It was people. Small acts of kindness that built something stronger, something that lasted. And sometimes, saving one child could change the world. The days turned into weeks after Grace left for her new home, and though the town had slowly returned to its usual routines, there were lingering ripples left in the wake of what had happened. The community had come together to help. The mansion had been sealed off, and Charles Evans was now facing charges that would ensure he never hurt anyone again. But for Officer Daniel Harris, life had taken on a new rhythm. Each morning, he patrolled the same quiet streets, waved to the same familiar faces, and responded to the usual calls: a lost dog here, a fender bender there. On the surface, everything was back to normal. Yet Daniel carried something with him now, a subtle shift, a quiet resolve. He had learned that saving one child could change everything, but it was not just about saving someone. It was about showing up over and over again, even when no one else would. One cold Saturday morning, Daniel stood in front of the community center, a cardboard cup of coffee warming his hands. Inside, volunteers were busy sorting donations and supplies for the foster families that had taken in the rescued children. It had become an ongoing effort, driven by the same community that had once looked the other way. "Officer Harris." The familiar voice broke through his thoughts, and Daniel turned to see Evelyn Hart making her way toward him. She wore a thick knitted coat with a bright blue scarf looped around her neck, the same color as the one she had given Grace. In her hands, she carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Morning, Evelyn," Daniel said with a smile. "You're out early." Evelyn waved a hand dismissively. "A little cold won't keep me inside. Besides, I made a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls for the volunteers. Nothing warms people up like a bit of sugar and kindness." Daniel chuckled softly, holding the door open for her as they entered the building. "You've got enough kindness for all of us, Evelyn." "Maybe," Evelyn said with a sly smile. "But I like to think it's contagious." Inside, the hall buzzed with quiet energy. Volunteers moved from table to table, sorting clothes, organizing toys, and packing supplies for the families who had opened their homes to the rescued children. It was a small act of redemption for a town that had been blindsided by its own neglect. Daniel set down his coffee and began helping where he could stack boxes, greeting volunteers, and offering quiet thanks to those who showed up. It was not flashy work, but it mattered. He was taping up a box when Sarah appeared beside him, a clipboard in hand. "Busy morning," she said with a smile. "Yeah," Daniel replied, pressing the tape down with a satisfying thump. "Good turnout, though," Sarah nodded, looking around the room. "The Foster families say the kids are settling in well. There's still a lot to process, but they're getting the help they need." Daniel paused, his thoughts drifting to Grace. "And her?" Sarah's expression softened. "Margaret says she's doing great. The Monroes love her, and apparently she's become best friends with their dog, Scout." A small smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's mouth. "That's good to hear." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "You should go see her, you know. She'd like that." Daniel hesitated. He had promised Grace that he would check on her, but he wasn't sure if seeing him again would help or hold her back. "You think so?" Sarah rolled her eyes with a laugh. "Yes, you're not as forgettable as you think, Daniel." That afternoon, Daniel found himself driving out to Ashton Grove. The air was crisp, and the sky was pale blue as he followed the winding road through the small neighborhood where Grace now lived. The houses here were warm and inviting, with tidy yards and welcoming porches, the kind of place where kids rode bikes and dogs barked joyfully at passing cars. Daniel pulled up in front of a cozy two-story house with a white picket fence. The name Monroe was painted neatly on the mailbox. A large golden retriever Scout, he assumed, stood on the front porch, his tail wagging as he watched Daniel climb out of the car. Before Daniel could reach the door, it opened, and Grace stepped outside. She wore a soft yellow sweater and the familiar blue scarf Evelyn had knitted for her. The stuffed rabbit was clutched under her arm, its ears still worn from days of constant comfort. For a moment, she just stared at him, her wide brown eyes searching his face. Then, her lips curved into the smallest, shyest smile. "You came," she said softly. Daniel crouched to her level, offering her the warm smile he always saved for her. "I told you I would, didn't I?" Grace nodded, shifting on her feet as she hugged the rabbit tighter. Behind her, the golden retriever barked and padded down the porch steps, nuzzling Daniel's arm as if inspecting him. "Scout likes you," Grace said, watching the dog. Daniel laughed, scratching behind Scout's ears. "He's got good taste." "Do you want to come in?" she asked after a moment. Daniel hesitated, but before he could answer, a warm voice called from the house. "Grace? Who's at the door?" A woman appeared in the doorway, Lisa Monroe. Margaret had told him about her. She was in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an easy smile. Her husband, Robert, followed her out, carrying a tray of lemonade. "You must be Officer Harris," Lisa said, extending her hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you. Grace has told us all about you." Daniel shook her hand, feeling a faint blush rise to his cheeks. "It's nice to meet you too, ma'am." Robert grinned as he set down the tray. "Grace said you're her hero. She's even been teaching Scout to sit still by calling him Officer Scout." Grace's face turned red, and she ducked her head, but Daniel only smiled. "He's probably a better listener than I am." Daniel spent the afternoon on the front porch, drinking lemonade and talking with the Monroes. Grace sat cross-legged at his feet, showing him the tricks she had taught Scout. She was different now, lighter somehow. The tension that had once gripped her small frame now replaced with cautious joy. When it was time to leave, Grace followed Daniel to his car, Scout at her heels. She looked up at him, the blue scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Will you come back again?" Daniel crouched so they were eye level, his voice steady and kind. "You bet, kiddo. Anytime you want." She nodded, her small fingers brushing against the rabbit's worn ears. "Okay." Daniel reached out and gently adjusted the scarf around her neck. "You're doing great, Grace. I'm proud of you." She smiled, a real smile this time, and it was brighter than anything he had seen before. "Thank you," she whispered. As Daniel climbed into his car and drove away, He watched her in the rearview mirror, standing on the sidewalk with Scout beside her. She waved once, and he waved back, his chest swelling with a quiet mix of pride and hope. That evening, as Daniel sat alone on the steps of his small apartment, he looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. He thought of Grace, of Evelyn, of the people who had shown up when it mattered most. They had proven something simple but profound. Kindness could change the world, one small act at a time. The girl who had whispered, "Please save me," was safe now, and though her journey was far from over, she was no longer walking it alone. Daniel leaned back, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and made himself a quiet promise. He would keep showing up, keep fighting for kids like Grace. Because sometimes, all it took to change a life was someone who refused to look away. In the darkness, a small smile tugged at his lips as he whispered to the night, "Sometimes saving one is enough." The girl who had once whispered, "Please save me," was no longer the same. Grace had found safety, care, and kindness from strangers who refused to look away. She had shown the world that even the smallest voice could lead to a powerful change. And for Officer Daniel Harris, her story was a quiet reminder of what mattered most: showing up, listening, and choosing kindness, no matter how dark the world seemed. It was not grand gestures or perfect answers that saved lives, but people, ordinary people, choosing to care. As Daniel looked up at the night sky, he knew the journey was far from over. For Grace, for the children rescued, and for others still waiting to be found, there was always more work to do. But there was also hope. Because sometimes, saving just one life could change everything. Dear friends, if you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of kindness, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll find more heartfelt and inspiring stories, like this one, stories that remind us of the courage, compassion, and hope we all share. Together, we can spread positivity, one story at a time. Thank you for watching.